Please, whatever you think you saw, forget it ever happened. Those were the first words Ethan Brooks heard after opening the wrong apartment door, and they would become the reason two completely different lives could never return to what they had been just seconds before. On the 22nd floor of Harbor Point residences overlooking the gray morning waters of Elliott Bay, people usually kept to themselves. Successful professionals hurried toward elevators with expensive coffee cups in hand. Quiet retirees walked their dogs before sunrise. Delivery drivers moved through the lobby without learning anyone's name. Everyone lived only a few feet apart, yet most neighbors remained strangers. Ethan preferred it that way. At 39, he had learned that peace often lived inside ordinary routines. Every weekday began the same. He packed 9-year-old Lily's lunch before dawn, carefully cutting her apple slices exactly the way she liked them because she insisted they tasted sweeter that way. He reminded her to bring her violin case. He checked the weather, zipped her jacket, and promised they would make homemade pancakes on Saturday morning if she finished practicing her newest orchestra piece. It wasn't an extraordinary life, but it was theirs, and after losing so much years earlier, Ethan had stopped measuring happiness by money. He measured it by promises he could still keep. That Thursday morning, however, nothing followed its usual rhythm. A burst water pipe had forced maintenance crews to temporarily shut down several hallways while residents were redirected through unfamiliar corridors. Ethan had been carrying 2 grocery bags, his toolbox from work, and Lily's forgotten music folder after she called from school in a panic. Distracted by the phone conversation and the confusing detour signs taped along the hallway walls, he stepped out of the elevator 1 floor higher than usual without realizing it. Apartment 2208 looked almost identical to his own. The welcome mat matched. The brass numbers reflected the same warm hallway lights. Even the small potted fern beside the door reminded him of home. Still talking to Lily through his wireless earbuds, he slipped his spare key into the lock. The door opened. He took exactly 3 steps inside before everything stopped. The apartment was silent except for soft piano music drifting from hidden ceiling speakers. Sunlight poured through floor-to-ceiling windows, washing the elegant room in pale gold. A single framed photograph rested on the fireplace, turned face down as though someone never wanted it seen. Near the center of the room stood a woman frozen in place, her expression stripped of every trace of confidence that had made magazine covers and business conferences celebrate her as one of America's youngest technology CEOs. Victoria Hayes stared at Ethan with unmistakable shock, while one hand instinctively rested over a small wooden memory box sitting open on the dining table. Neither of them spoke for several long seconds. Ethan immediately realized his mistake. "I'm so sorry," he said quietly, pulling one earbud free. "I thought this was my apartment." He stepped backward toward the hallway remained unusually quiet after Ethan Brooks returned to the floor where he actually lived, yet his thoughts refused to settle. He unlocked apartment 2108, placed the grocery bags on the kitchen counter, and stood still for a long moment while the refrigerator hummed softly in the background. He had accidentally stepped into another person's private world, and although curiosity naturally whispered questions, experience had taught him something far more valuable than curiosity. Some doors were meant to be closed with kindness instead of opened with judgment. His phone vibrated across the countertop. Lily's cheerful voice immediately filled the room. "Daddy, did you find my music folder?" Ethan smiled despite everything. "I did. I will bring it during my lunch break." "You are the best." "That is because I have the best daughter." She laughed. "Do not forget pancakes on Saturday." A promise is a promise. When the call ended, the apartment felt peaceful again. It was small compared to many homes inside Harbor Point residences, but every corner carried memories that mattered. A framed crayon drawing labeled "Best Dad" ever hung beside the refrigerator. A second-hand piano rested against the living room wall because Lily had fallen in love with music after hearing a school orchestra perform 2 years earlier. The furniture did not match perfectly. The coffee table had been repaired twice. The sofa had survived countless movie nights. Nothing looked luxurious, yet everything belonged. Ethan picked up his work jacket before leaving for the engineering company where he maintained heating, ventilation, and electrical systems throughout downtown Seattle. The job demanded patience more than recognition, and he preferred it exactly that way. Machines usually responded better than pride. During lunch, he drove across town to deliver Lily's folder to her elementary school. She ran toward him outside the music room with the excitement only children could carry into an ordinary Thursday. "I knew you would come," she said as she hugged him tightly. Ethan handed her the folder. "I also brought your favorite oatmeal cookie." Her eyes widened. "You remembered." "I remember everything that matters." Her music teacher smiled as she watched them. "She talks about you every day, Mr. Brooks." Ethan chuckled softly. "Hopefully only the good stories." Lily looked up proudly. "Daddy says people should always leave a place a little better than they found it." The teacher nodded thoughtfully. "That is good advice." Ethan only shrugged with quiet embarrassment. To him, it had never sounded like wisdom. It was simply the easiest way to live. Across the city, Victoria Hay sat at the head of a conference table surrounded by executives discussing quarterly projections worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Colorful graphs filled the presentation screens. Analysts debated expansion strategies. Lawyers reviewed acquisition documents. Victoria answered every question with her usual precision, yet her attention drifted again and again toward the memory of the quiet neighbor who had walked into the wrong apartment and left without asking for a single explanation. One executive noticed her distraction. "Is everything all right?" Victoria looked back at the financial reports. "Yes," she answered automatically, although she knew it was not entirely true. She had spent years believing that wealth attracted two kinds of people: those who wanted access and those who wanted advantage. Yet Ethan Brooks had wanted neither. He had looked directly at a moment capable of changing everything, then chosen respect over opportunity. That decision made less sense to her than any business negotiation she had ever completed. Later that evening, she returned home carrying a leather briefcase in one hand and exhaustion in the other. The elevator doors opened onto the 22nd floor just as another resident stepped inside, holding grocery bags and a small bouquet of fresh daisies. Victoria recognized him immediately. Ethan looked up with the same calm expression he had worn that morning. There was no awkward smile, no hint that they shared an uncomfortable secret. He simply stepped aside to give her room. "Good evening," he said politely. "Good evening," she replied. The elevator descended in comfortable silence until Lily's laughter echoed from the lobby below. She came running toward her father after finishing orchestra practice with her violin case bouncing lightly against her shoulder. "Daddy, I played the whole piece without stopping." Ethan knelt beside her. "I knew you could." Lily noticed Victoria standing nearby and offered the bright smile children gave without measuring social status. "Hello." Victoria smiled back almost instinctively. "Hello there." Lily turned proudly toward her father. "Can Miss Neighbor come hear me practice someday?" Ethan laughed softly, surprised by the question. Before he could answer, Victoria heard herself saying something she had not planned. "I would like that very much." That night, the rain returned to Seattle in a soft, steady rhythm, washing the glass walls of Harbor Point residences until the city lights blurred into ribbons of silver and gold. Ethan Brooks sat beside Lily at the old piano while she practiced the same 8 measures again and again. She stumbled once, sighed dramatically, and looked at him with frustrated eyes. "I keep missing the last note." Ethan smiled and folded his hands across his knees. "Then do not think about the last note. Think about the next right note." Lily tried again. This time the melody flowed naturally from beginning to end. She turned toward him with a grin. "It worked." Ethan nodded. Most good things happen one step at a time. Across the hallway and one floor above, Victoria Hay stood alone in her enormous living room. The apartment overlooked nearly the entire waterfront, yet she barely noticed the breathtaking view anymore. Awards lined custom shelves. Business magazines displayed her photograph beside headlines celebrating innovation and leadership. Every achievement represented years of sacrifice, discipline, and impossible decisions. Yet none of those accomplishments explained the small wooden memory box that remained open on her dining table. She slowly walked toward it and lifted a faded photograph with careful hands. The picture showed a younger Victoria standing beside an older man wearing grease-stained coveralls inside a modest neighborhood repair shop. Both of them were smiling. She gently traced the edges of the photograph before placing it back inside the box. It was the only place where she allowed herself to remember the life she had spent years trying to hide. The next morning began with another series of meetings inside Hayes Technologies headquarters. Investors filled the conference room while analysts presented forecasts for an upcoming merger that financial reporters were already calling the largest technology partnership of the year. Victoria listened quietly until one board member cleared his throat. "There is one final matter," he said carefully. "Our public image remains one of our greatest assets. Any unexpected personal stories involving executive leadership could affect shareholder confidence." Victoria remained perfectly still. "Is there a reason you mentioned that?" The director exchanged a cautious glance with the company's legal advisor. "Only as a reminder that perception influences markets as much as..." The invitation came 2 evenings later in the simplest way imaginable. Ethan had just returned from work carrying a small paper bag from the neighborhood grocery store when Lily spotted Victoria stepping out of the elevator with a reusable shopping basket balanced against one hip. Without hesitation, Lily waved enthusiastically. "Miss Neighbor." Victoria looked up, surprised by the little girl's excitement. "Hello, Lily." Lily held up her violin case proudly. "I practiced every day like I promised. Do you still want to hear me play?" Victoria hesitated for only a heartbeat before smiling. "I would be honored." Ethan glanced toward Victoria with quiet understanding. "Only if you have time. There is absolutely no pressure." She looked from the father to the daughter, then nodded gently. "I have time." Their apartment was warm with the familiar scent of tomato soup and freshly baked bread. The furniture was modest, the walls decorated with family photographs instead of expensive artwork, and a small vase of wildflowers rested in the center of the kitchen table. Victoria noticed how everything seemed chosen for comfort rather than appearance. Nothing looked designed to impress anyone. Lily hurried to the piano, opened her music book, and carefully adjusted her violin beneath her chin. Ethan sat nearby, without saying a word. He simply gave his daughter an encouraging smile. The first few notes were uncertain, but little by little the melody settled into a graceful rhythm. It was not a flawless performance. A few notes wandered slightly off pitch. One transition came a fraction too late. Yet every measure carried something polished perfection often forgot. Heart. When the final note faded into silence, Victoria found herself applauding before she even realized she had moved. Lily's face lit up. "Really?" Victoria nodded sincerely. "Really? That was beautiful." Lily laughed. "Daddy always says music is supposed to tell the truth, not show off." Victoria looked toward Ethan. "That sounds like something worth remembering." Ethan smiled modestly. "I think people remember feelings much longer than perfect performances." Lily disappeared into the kitchen to check on dinner, leaving the two adults standing beside the old piano. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Rain tapped softly against the windows while the evening light settled into a warm amber glow across the room. Victoria finally broke the silence. "I never thanked you." "Properly." Ethan looked puzzled. "For what?" "For keeping your promise without ever making one." Ethan leaned lightly against the piano. "I'm not sure I understand." She lowered her voice. "You never asked questions. You never looked at me differently. Most people would have." Ethan considered her words before answering. "There are moments in life when people need witnesses. There are other moments when they need privacy. I believed you needed the second one." Victoria looked down, quietly absorbing every word. "Do you know how many people have wanted something from me since I became chief executive officer?" Ethan smiled gently. "I imagine the list is long. Very long." She paused. "You were the first person in years who wanted absolutely nothing." Ethan folded his arms comfortably. "That is because I already have everything I spend my days trying to protect." At that exact moment, Lily returned carrying 3 bowls of soup. "Dinner is ready." Victoria blinked, surprised. "Oh, I could not possibly impose." Lily frowned with genuine confusion. "Daddy says neighbors should never eat alone." Ethan laughed softly. "She remembers everything I tell her." Victoria looked around the small dining table, where 3 simple bowls waited beside homemade bread still warm from the oven. No assistants, no reservations, no cameras, no expectations, just kindness offered without calculation. She slowly pulled out a chair. "In that case," she said quietly, "thank you." Throughout dinner, the conversation wandered from favorite books to school concerts, from Seattle rain to childhood memories. No one mentioned stock prices or billion-dollar contracts. No one asked about the secret she had guarded for so many years. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Victoria was not speaking as a celebrated executive or a public figure. She was simply another neighbor sharing a meal. As she prepared to leave later that evening, she paused at the apartment door and looked back toward Ethan washing dishes while Lily carefully dried them beside him. They worked together without hurry, laughing over some small joke she could not quite hear. Victoria suddenly realized that everything she had spent years building had made her successful, but almost nothing had taught her how to feel at home. Quietly, without either of them noticing, the walls she had spent more than a decade constructing around her heart began to give way. Over the following weeks, an unfamiliar rhythm quietly settled into all three of their lives. It never arrived with dramatic declarations or carefully planned meetings. Instead, it appeared through ordinary moments that somehow became unforgettable. Victoria began leaving her office a little earlier whenever her schedule allowed. Ethan continued picking Lily up after orchestra practice every Tuesday and Thursday. More often than not, they would meet in the lobby at nearly the same time. Sometimes they shared the elevator. Sometimes they walked the final few blocks home together after stopping for hot chocolate from the neighborhood cafe. The conversations remained simple. Lily spoke excitedly about school projects, music competitions, and the stray orange cat she hoped someone would eventually adopt. Ethan listened with the same patient attention he always gave his daughter. Victoria found herself smiling more than speaking, quietly observing something she had not experienced in years. No one interrupted Lily. No one glanced at a phone while she talked. Every story mattered because she mattered. One Saturday morning, Lily knocked gently on Victoria's apartment door, holding a small paper bag decorated with colorful hand-drawn flowers. Victoria answered wearing jeans and a loose sweater instead of the tailored business suit seen on magazine covers. "Good morning," Lily said brightly. "Daddy made blueberry muffins, and he says neighbors should never bake for just one family." Victoria laughed softly. "Your father has many rules about kindness." Lily nodded proudly. "They usually work." Inside the paper bag rested 4 warm muffins wrapped carefully in a clean kitchen towel. Tucked beside them was a handwritten note in Ethan's neat handwriting. "I hope your weekend gives you time to rest. Enjoy." No signature. No expectation of thanks. Victoria stared at the note for several quiet seconds before placing it carefully inside the same memory box where she kept her father's letters. Somehow it belonged there. That afternoon, she walked downstairs carrying a small wooden toolbox. Ethan was replacing a loose hinge on one of Lily's bookshelves while classic jazz music drifted softly through the apartment. He looked up in surprise. "Good afternoon." Victoria held out the toolbox with both hands. "I thought you might like this." Ethan opened it slowly. Inside rested an old collection of polished mechanics tools, each one carefully maintained despite their age. His expression immediately softened. "These are beautiful." Victoria nodded. "They belong to my father." Ethan looked at her with quiet hesitation. "That feels like something too valuable to accept." She smiled gently. "I am not giving them away." She paused before continuing. "I was wondering if you could help me clean them and teach me what each one was used for. I never learned while he was alive." Silence settled warmly between them. Ethan finally nodded. "I would be honored." Over the next several weekends, the old tools became unexpected bridges between two very different worlds. Sitting around Ethan's kitchen table covered with soft towels, he patiently explained the purpose of every wrench, socket, and gauge while Victoria listened like a student discovering a forgotten language. Lily organized each tool into neat rows and proudly announced herself the official quality inspector. Every lesson awakened another memory inside Victoria. She spoke about summers spent handing bolts to her father inside his tiny garage, the smell of engine oil mixed with fresh coffee, and the quiet satisfaction on his face whenever an old truck started again after hours of careful work. Ethan never interrupted those memories with advice or sympathy. He simply listened. Sometimes the greatest kindness was allowing another person to finish a story they had carried alone for years. One evening after Lily had gone to bed, Victoria stood beside the apartment window watching the city lights shimmer across Elliott Bay. "I spent years pretending that part of my life never existed," she admitted quietly. "Investors said people trusted polished success more than ordinary beginnings." Ethan rested 2 mugs of tea on the windowsill. "Did pretending make you happier?" Victoria answered without hesitation. "No." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "My daughter once asked why old trees are beautiful even when their bark is rough." Victoria looked toward him. "What did you tell her?" He smiled faintly. Because the rough places prove they survived every season before this one. Victoria lowered her eyes, feeling the truth of those words settle deep inside her heart. She had built an empire by hiding where she came from, yet the man standing beside her had quietly shown her that real dignity never asked anyone to erase their beginnings. For the first time since becoming the leader of one of the country's fastest-growing companies, Victoria no longer feared the woman she used to be. She feared only the possibility of losing the quiet family that had reminded her she had never needed to become someone else in order to become someone worthy of respect. Autumn arrived quietly over Seattle, carrying crisp mornings, golden maple leaves, and the promise of change that no calendar could fully explain. Ethan Brooks noticed little differences first. Lily needed a heavier jacket before school. The windows fogged while pancakes cooked on Saturday mornings. Victoria smiled more easily than she had only a month before. Life seemed to be finding a gentler rhythm until one ordinary Monday afternoon changed everything. Victoria had just finished presenting Hayes Technologies' newest artificial intelligence initiative to investors when her executive assistant entered the conference room with unusual urgency. She leaned down and whispered, "You need to see this immediately." Victoria excused herself and stepped into her private office. The assistant placed a tablet on the desk. Several financial news websites displayed the same headline. Anonymous source questions CEO's hidden past before billion-dollar rise. Victoria's expression remained calm, but her hands became perfectly still. She opened the article. The report contained almost no verified facts, yet it hinted that she had deliberately concealed important details about her upbringing, suggesting there were undisclosed motives behind her carefully crafted public image. Someone had somehow discovered fragments of the private history she had guarded for years. The article never mentioned the restored garage or her father's letters directly, but Victoria immediately understood where the story was heading. Within an hour, more headlines appeared. Television commentators speculated without evidence. Social media transformed ordinary memories into dramatic theories. By late afternoon, reporters had gathered outside company headquarters hoping for a statement. Inside the executive boardroom, the atmosphere changed from confidence to uncertainty. One director folded his hands across the polished conference table. "We are entering dangerous territory." Another adjusted his glasses before speaking. "Public trust drives investor confidence. We need answers before the market opens tomorrow morning." Victoria looked around the room she had led for nearly a decade. "There is nothing illegal to explain." A senior board member nodded carefully. "No one is accusing you of breaking the law." He paused before continuing. "But perception often moves faster than truth." Silence settled across the room. The words were polite, yet every person understood what remained unspoken. Stock prices could fall because of rumors alone. Partnerships could disappear because uncertainty frightened people more than facts. By the closing bell that afternoon, Hayes Technologies shares had already declined several percentage points as speculation spread across financial markets. Victoria returned home long after sunset, carrying the weight of thousands of employees whose livelihoods depended upon decisions she had yet to make. She unlocked her apartment, placed her briefcase beside the door, and stood quietly in the darkness without turning on a single light. The city skyline glittered outside her windows, but it brought no comfort tonight. Her phone continued vibrating with calls from attorneys, investors, and journalists. She silenced it completely. For the first time in years, she felt less like the leader of a company and more like the frightened young woman who had once watched her father lock the little repair shop each evening, wondering whether another customer would come tomorrow. A gentle knock interrupted the silence. Victoria hesitated before opening the door. Ethan stood in the hallway holding a covered glass baking dish. "Lily insisted you should not have dinner alone," he said with his familiar quiet smile. "She made too much chicken pot pie. At least that is what she claims." Victoria tried to smile in return, but exhaustion reached her eyes before gratitude reached her lips. Ethan noticed immediately. "Bad day." She gave a small nod. "It appears the world suddenly wants to know who I used to be." Ethan remained silent for a moment. Then he handed her the warm dish. "Maybe that is because they have forgotten that every successful person used to be someone else's child." She looked at him, surprised by the simplicity of the thought. "The board is meeting tomorrow morning," she admitted quietly. "Some people believe I should step aside until everything settles." Ethan did not rush to offer solutions. He simply asked one gentle question. Have you ever been ashamed of loving your father? Victoria answered immediately. Never. Then do not allow anyone to convince you that gratitude is something to hide. Those words stayed with her long after Ethan returned to his apartment. Late that night, Victoria unlocked the small wooden memory box once more. She removed the faded photograph of herself standing beside her father inside the old garage. For years, she had believed protecting his memory meant keeping it hidden from the world. Now, as uncertainty gathered outside her carefully built life, she slowly realized that perhaps the greatest danger had never been people discovering where she came from. Perhaps the greatest danger had been forgetting that those humble beginnings had always been the strongest part of who she truly was. The board meeting began before sunrise, long before the streets outside Hayes Technologies filled with commuters. Thick gray clouds pressed low over Seattle, and the rain tapped steadily against the towering glass windows overlooking the city. Around the polished conference table sat directors, legal advisors, financial analysts, and major investors whose combined decisions could influence the future of thousands of employees before lunchtime. Victoria Hayes entered the room with calm determination, carrying nothing except a slim leather folder and the small wooden memory box she had hidden from the world for more than a decade. Conversations faded the moment she took her seat. One director cleared his throat first. Victoria, before we discuss quarterly performance, we need to address the growing concerns surrounding recent media reports. Another director spoke more carefully. Several institutional investors are requesting clarification. They believe transparency is necessary before confidence can return. Victoria folded her hands quietly on the table. I understand. The chairman looked directly at her. Would you like to make a statement? Before she could answer, another voice came from the far end of the room. Excuse me. Every head turned. Standing near the doorway was Ethan Brooks, wearing his simple maintenance company uniform with a visitor badge clipped neatly to his jacket. He carried a small toolbox because he had been scheduled to inspect the building's emergency electrical systems that morning. One of the administrative assistants quickly explained, there is a brief issue with the conference room lighting controls. Maintenance was already on site. Ethan nodded politely. I will only need a few minutes. No one paid much attention as he quietly opened a ceiling access panel and began checking a control box near the back wall. The meeting continued. Another board member leaned forward. Victoria, some people believe your public biography intentionally omitted important details. She answered honestly. It did. A murmur moved around the table. She continued before anyone interrupted. Not because I was ashamed of my father, but because years ago I accepted terrible advice. I was told successful leaders should appear polished from the beginning. I believed hiding my ordinary childhood would make people trust me more. The room became still. She gently placed the wooden memory box on the table and opened it. Inside rested faded photographs, handwritten, letters, and worn mechanics tools polished by years of loving hands. My father repaired engines in a small garage outside Spokane. Everything I know about solving problems, keeping promises, and respecting honest work came from him. I protected these memories because they belonged to my family. I never imagined privacy would someday be mistaken for dishonesty. Silence settled across the boardroom. Several directors looked thoughtfully at the photographs. One investor quietly removed his glasses. Another folded the newspaper that had carried the morning headlines. At that moment, the ceiling lights flickered once before returning to normal. Ethan climbed down from the small ladder after completing the repair. Everything should be working properly now, he said politely. The chairman thanked him, but before Ethan reached the door, one elderly director spoke unexpectedly. Young man. Ethan stopped and turned. Yes, sir. The director glanced toward Victoria, then back at Ethan. You live in the same building, do you not? Ethan nodded. Yes. Have you known about this for some time? Ethan understood exactly what he meant. Every eye in the room shifted toward him. He answered with complete calm. I know that Miss Hayes honors her father. He paused briefly. I also know that a person's private memories are not my story to tell. The room remained perfectly quiet. Ethan continued gently. I spend my days repairing systems that people only notice when something breaks. Families work much the same way. Some things are held together by trust. Once that trust is broken, it is very difficult to repair. No one interrupted. I have watched Miss Hayes treat every security guard, receptionist, custodian, an engineer in our building with respect. I have watched her encourage a little girl learning to play the violin. I have watched her remember where she came from instead of pretending she never had a beginning. If you want to measure character, perhaps start there." He lowered his head respectfully. "Please excuse me. I have another service call waiting." Ethan quietly picked up his toolbox and walked toward the door without another word. No applause followed him. No dramatic speeches filled the room. Only silence. The kind of silence that appears when truth quietly replaces assumption. The chairman slowly looked around the table before speaking in a softer voice than anyone had ever heard from him. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I believe we have spent the morning discussing the wrong question. The issue has never been where our chief executive officer came from. The issue is whether she has led this company with integrity." One by one, heads around the table began to nod, and for the first time since the rumors had begun, Victoria realized that the strongest voice in the room had belonged to the one man who never came there intending to speak at all. The days that followed unfolded far differently than anyone inside Hayes Technologies had predicted. News outlets that had eagerly repeated rumors now carried a different story. Instead of questioning Victoria Hayes's past, they began highlighting the remarkable journey from a mechanic's daughter to one of the nation's most respected technology leaders. Former employees shared stories of scholarships she had quietly funded. Maintenance workers described how she greeted them by name every morning. Young engineers spoke about handwritten notes of encouragement she had left after difficult projects. Little by little, speculation gave way to something far more difficult to manufacture: respect. By the end of the week, the company's stock had recovered, then quietly climbed beyond where it had stood before the rumors began. Investors returned. Business partners renewed their confidence. The board publicly affirmed its unanimous support for Victoria's leadership. Yet the greatest change could not be measured on financial reports or quarterly earnings. It happened inside Victoria herself. For years, every hour of her calendar had been planned months in advance. Breakfast meetings, investor calls, product reviews, international conferences. Success had filled every empty space until there was no room left for ordinary life. One Friday afternoon, her executive assistant entered with an updated schedule. "Your flight to New York leaves at 5:30. The media interviews begin tomorrow morning." Victoria looked down at the neatly organized itinerary before gently closing the folder. "Cancel the trip." The assistant blinked in surprise. "Cancel all of it." Victoria smiled peacefully. "Lily has her orchestra concert tonight. The investors have already confirmed attendance in New York." Victoria nodded. "They can wait until Monday." The assistant stood speechless for several seconds before quietly smiling. "I will make the arrangements." That evening, Harbor Point residences buzzed with the familiar sounds of families returning home. Ethan tied Lily's blue concert ribbon while she nervously practiced invisible finger positions in the air. "What if I forget part of the music?" she whispered. Ethan knelt beside her and straightened her violin case strap. "Then you take one slow breath and find the next right note." Lily smiled. "You always say that." "Because it always works." A gentle knock came at the door. Victoria stood outside wearing a simple navy coat instead of her usual business attire. In one hand, she carried a small bouquet of white daisies. "I hope I am not late." Lily threw her arms into the air excitedly. "You came." Victoria laughed softly. "I promised I would." The elementary school auditorium smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh programs printed only hours earlier. Parents filled every row while children adjusted instruments with nervous excitement behind the curtain. Ethan, Victoria, and dozens of other families settled quietly into their seats beneath the warm stage lights. Just before the performance began, Ethan's phone vibrated. A supervisor from work apologized for an unexpected electrical issue at a downtown office building and asked whether he could respond immediately. Ethan listened carefully before answering. "I am sorry. I cannot tonight." There was a brief pause. "My daughter needs me here." He ended the call without another word and slipped the phone into his pocket. Victoria looked toward him with quiet curiosity. Was it important? Ethan smiled gently. "Everything is important to someone." He glanced toward the stage where Lily waited with her orchestra. "But not everything is most important." Victoria followed his gaze. The curtain slowly opened. Rows of young musicians lifted their instruments together. Lily searched the audience until she found Ethan and Victoria sitting side by side. Seeing them both smiling back, Her shoulders relaxed. The conductor raised the baton. The music began. The first few notes floated gently through the auditorium before growing into something bright, hopeful, and wonderfully alive. Ethan watched with the quiet pride only a parent truly understands. Beside him, Victoria felt unexpected tears gathering in her eyes. She had spent years chasing moments that newspapers called historic, but none of them had ever filled her heart the way one little girl confidently playing her violin for the people she loved did. When the final note echoed into silence, the audience rose in heartfelt applause. Lily looked directly toward Ethan first. Then she turned toward Victoria. Her smile seemed to say, without speaking, that both of them belonged there. As the applause continued around them, Victoria realized she had finally discovered something more valuable than influence, recognition, or success. She had found a place where she was appreciated not for the company she had built, but simply for showing up when someone she loved needed her most. Nearly 1 year passed, and the seasons quietly completed their circle. Spring rain gave way to bright summer mornings. Autumn painted the trees in shades of amber, and winter wrapped Seattle in soft gray skies before another spring finally arrived. Yet through every changing season, the small routines inside Harbor Point residences remained wonderfully familiar. Ethan Brooks still rose before sunrise to prepare Lily's breakfast before school. Lily still practiced her violin each evening beside the old piano that had become the heart of their apartment. Victoria Hayes still led one of the nation's fastest-growing technology companies, but the people who worked closest to her noticed something remarkable. She no longer rushed through conversations. She no longer measured every hour by productivity alone. She visited the restored garage outside Spokane more often, inviting young engineering interns to see where her father had taught her that honesty was more valuable than perfection. Above the entrance, she quietly placed a simple wooden sign that read, "Character is built one honest repair at a time." The little garage eventually became a community workshop where teenagers learned practical skills from retired mechanics who volunteered simply because they wanted to help the next generation. Whenever reporters asked Victoria what inspired the project, she always answered the same way. "Someone reminded me that no beginning is ever too ordinary to be honored." She never mentioned Ethan's name. She never needed to. One bright Saturday afternoon, Harbor Point Residences held its annual neighborhood picnic in the courtyard overlooking Elliott Bay. Families unfolded lawn chairs beneath blooming cherry trees, while children played games across the fresh green grass. Local musicians performed gentle acoustic songs, and neighbors who had barely known each other a year earlier now laughed together like old friends. Lily stood on the small community stage with several classmates to perform a short spring concert. As the final song ended, applause echoed warmly across the courtyard. Victoria found Ethan standing near the refreshment table, holding 2 cups of lemonade. "One for you," he said with his familiar smile. She accepted the cup. "Thank you." They watched Lily laughing with her friends for a quiet moment before Victoria spoke again. "Do you ever think about that morning?" Ethan looked toward the apartment building rising behind them. "Which morning?" She smiled softly. "The day you accidentally opened the wrong door." Ethan laughed gently. "I try not to make a habit of entering other people's apartments." Victoria shook her head with quiet amusement. "Neither do I." The breeze carried the scent of fresh flowers across the courtyard as silence settled comfortably between them. It was no longer the uncertain silence of strangers. It was the peaceful silence shared by people who no longer needed to explain themselves. Victoria reached into her handbag and removed a small silver key attached to a simple leather keychain. She placed it carefully into Ethan's hand. He looked at it with confusion. "What is this?" "A key. I gathered that much." She smiled. "It opens my apartment." Ethan looked back at her, puzzled. Victoria continued before he could misunderstand. "Not because I expect you to walk in whenever you like." She laughed softly. "We have both learned enough about unexpected entrances." Ethan smiled. "That is true." Her expression grew warmer. "It is because I realized something over this past year. Home is not protected by locked doors. Home is protected by the people you trust enough to hand them the key." Ethan looked down at the small key resting quietly in his palm. He understood the gift had very little to do with the apartment itself. It was trust. It was friendship. It was the quiet courage to let another person become part of your life. Before he could answer, Lily came running toward them with bright eyes and wind-blown hair. "Miss Neighbor," she called happily. "Daddy promised pancakes tonight, and I told everybody you make the best blueberry syrup. Are you coming?" Victoria looked at Ethan. He smiled the same calm smile that had first reassured her on the hardest day of her life. "We always have room for one more at the table." Victoria felt tears gently fill her eyes, not from sadness, but from gratitude. "I would love to come." As the three of them walked back toward the apartment building beneath the warm evening light, Ethan glanced at the silver key still resting in his hand. Victoria noticed and smiled. "This time," she said quietly, "I hope you come through the right door." Ethan looked at her, then toward Lily skipping happily a few steps ahead, and smiled with peaceful certainty. "I think," he answered softly, "I finally already have." And as the sun settled beyond Elliott Bay, no headline, no fortune, and no title seemed more valuable than the quiet truth they had discovered together. The strongest homes are never built from concrete, glass, or expensive views. They are built one promise, one act of kindness, and one open door at a time.